just saying, what sort of damage does too much nitrogen do to the waters around Long Island?
It can have a lot of effects. The first effect is going to be these sorts of algal blooms we've been seeing, these brown tides, red tides, rust tides. And then there's trickle-down effects. Those algal blooms make the water very turbid, and therefore light's not getting to eelgrass, so we lose our eelgrass. And then shellfish and fish rely on the eelgrass for habitat, so we start to have declines in fisheries. And furthermore, some of these algae are directly toxic to fish and shellfish, and that can also give a negative effect to our fisheries. So, the input is the nitrogen, the output is less fish and shellfish.
All right, so but a whole list of problems.
Yep.
And seems to be getting worse, would you say?
The data shows that the levels of nitrogen in groundwater are increasing. The levels of nitrogen going into the bays and in the bays is higher. So yeah, with time the levels are increasing, and the intensity of these issues is also increasing.
And what is the source of the biggest excess of nitrogen going?
Island-wide, it's wastewater, so from household waste. There are some areas where it's fertilizer, for example, the North Fork of Long Island, but when we look at the whole South Shore bays, going all the way from Nassau County through Great South Bay, Moriches Bay, Shinnecock Bay, it's homes and their septic tanks that are leaching into the coastal bays there.
Okay, so comparatively, it's how much of that versus, unless you just said that and I missed it, versus fertilizer?
Yeah, they both contribute, but the biggest source, particularly in those South Shore bays, is the household waste. Yeah.
That's more than half the problem?
Yes, certainly more than half, yeah. 60, in some places up to 70% of the nitrogen coming in can be from those septic tanks.
Okay, that much, okay. And you touched on this, but he wants an explanation of how the nitrogen gets into the aquifers and migrates towards the bays.
Right, so all of Long Island is a watershed, so any activity on the land or just below the land is going to affect the bay. So, for example, the application of fertilizer, it seeps down through the groundwater. Septic tanks that are leaching their contents seeps down into the groundwater, and then that groundwater slowly seeps out into the coastal waters. It depends. It can take decades for that groundwater to make it there, particularly if you're talking about groundwater that originates further in the island. But eventually, all the water that goes onto the land seeps through the land and then comes out into our coastal bays and estuaries.
Okay. And why is the excess nitrogen so harmful?
Again, it goes back to, it starts at the top, starts at the bottom of the food chain, and, it affects these algal blooms that then have these trickle-down effects. It can also be, high levels of nitrogen can also be toxic to salt marshes, or can at least inhibit salt marshes, make them weaker. That's another important habitat in these bays, and there is some evidence that even the nitrogen itself is harmful to eelgrass, for example, without even having to invoke the light and the algal blooms.
So it just affects all levels.
Yes, exactly.
Eventually.
Yeah. Sometimes it's direct. It's direct for plants, salt marshes, eelgrasses, and algae blooms, and then it's going to be indirect for things like shellfish and fish.
Right. Okay. And what do you think should be done to limit or control the nitrogen discharging?
Well, there's plenty of environmentally sensitive areas, and in those areas we've got to get a handle on it. And in many cases, the biggest source are those septic tanks and cesspools. We already took care of that in places like Nassau County. They were developed with sewage treatment plants. We need something to deal with the septic tanks in Suffolk County. Probably not large sewage treatment plants, but there are alternative technologies available to reduce the amount of nitrogen going from those septic tanks into the groundwater.
And last question for Pat. Do you think Long Islanders are really aware of the harm that the lawn fertilizers are causing to bays?
I think the awareness is developing. The information, it's been in the last decade that the information has come together from scientists like myself and other researchers. And now that information's getting out, and I think the awareness is growing, but I think probably more people need to become aware of all this as well.
So backtrack and just talking about the rust tide and
Sure.
how big of an issue that is for water, shellfish, and what have you.
Yeah, well, this rust tide is caused by an algae known as Cochlididium. It secretes a toxin that can be lethal to fish and shellfish. And when particularly small fish and shellfish come into contact with these algal blooms, they can die within a matter of hours for the fish, longer for the shellfish. So it can be a serious problem in areas where it's very densely concentrated.
Okay, and for the shellfish, how long? It still doesn't take that long for it to...
Shellfish, it depends how large the shellfish are. It can take days, weeks, but again, if they're consistently exposed to this algal bloom, they're not going to fare well.
And that's, again, this is coming from where specifically?
You mean the ultimate cause, or the?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we know one of the big factors in this rust tide is heavy nitrogen loading. It depends on the area, and the Peconics are some areas where it's fertilizer, and Shinnecock Bay here, there's some area it's more septic tanks. But we've done the research that shows that the more nitrogen you put into the system, the faster these algae grow, and in turn, the stronger their impacts are on the ecosystem.
And we talked to Ed about this too, but has it been getting significantly worse over the years? Is it leveling off at all?
We had never seen it before 2004. It showed up in 2004, and it's returning every single year. The last 2 years or a few years were quite intense. We'll see what 2013 holds. It's just starting up, and it may spread to the east, or it may be more moderate this year. The temperatures have been a little bit more moderate, so we'll wait and see for this particular year.
Okay, and what, if anything, can be done to tackle this now?
Right. Well, I mean, if we know that nitrogen is enhancing the growth of these organisms, we know that if we can restrict the inputs of those nitrogen, be it from fertilizer or from wastewater, that we can start to have a positive effect by reducing the impacts on our marine environment.
But even with, he had mentioned this too, whatever you start now could still take years, a couple decades to really see some sort of a difference. Would that be true?
That is true for all of Long Island. On the east end here, however, there's not that much land, and the travel times of groundwater are slow. And in fact, the research has shown that most of the septic tanks on the east end are within a 1 or 2 year time travel for groundwater. So here in the east end in particular, it's the situation where if you can reduce the flow of nitrogen from those septic tanks, you may see, or we should see, a more immediate impact because there's not that much land, as opposed to, say, in the middle of Long Island, the groundwater travel times are longer, decades.
Okay, and it's just really like an orange rust color, which is where the name is.
They're dense aggregations, and when they come together, it sort of depends on the perspective that you're looking at it. From up above, it can look orange, a brownish color. It can even have a reddish tinge if you're sort of looking on a boat across the water.
Okay, and I know we're a bit far from it, but the inlet, the new old inlet, having any effect on this?
Well, we've seen it. In 2011, we saw coccolinium in Great South Bay. We haven't seen it yet in Great South Bay, so far that may be helping us.
Maybe helping,
yeah.
Okay, but not clear at this point. If that's
not clear yet, that's right.
Okay, all right, I'm good.